Hi, I'm Maureen Curis with Radiant Morning, and today I have Mary Eberle here with me to talk about her company, which is DNA Hunters. She founded this in 2015 after a career as a biotech patent attorney and a scientist. And she employs the power of DNA to find birth parents of adoptees and others of unknown parents and grandparents. Members of the new DNA Hunter Society achieve their family research goals through DNA lessons and a dedicated community. This has just been so interesting to me since I've met Mary because my cousin did one of these DNA tests and found her birth parents. She had no desire to find them, but ended up finding them because of this, and has now built some relationships with her mom and her half sister. So it's been an interesting journey. So Mary, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you, Maureen. It's great to be here.
I really appreciate it. Like I said, since I first heard what you do, I'm a fan. So tell me, how did you get into this work?
Well, I have a long background working in DNA research labs. That started over 30 years ago. And after 10 years, I went back to school. I became a patent attorney, and I've really focused on the sciences and a lot of inventions that involve DNA. So I've had this DNA interest pretty much my whole life. And I had left my law practice, and I actually saw a TV show called Finding Your Roots. And on it, they had a DNA expert, C.C. Moore, who helped the host find his long lost father's line.
Wow.
And I'm a hobbyist genealogist. At the time, I didn't realize that people were using DNA to further their genealogy. So that's
That's so interesting. I have a friend that she and her husband somehow were chosen to be, and I can't remember the name of it, a few years ago, where they had to give samples of their DNA, and then it was the family race or something. It was called something, but they had to start in San Francisco with three other couples, and they found relatives that the relative race, that's what it was called. But based on their DNA, they found relatives, and they had to go and find them and work their way across the country to get to the Statue of Liberty. But they found relatives all across the country for these couples, all based on DNA. So my friend and her husband met people they had no idea even existed and that were related to them. It was very interesting. So it was fun to watch each week.
neat.
So, Mary, for finding birth parents of adoptees and others with unknown parents, do you ever discover like if health issues run in the family?
Excuse me. Yes, I have seen that in some families where I'm looking at their DNA matches and I'm building out trees. And in building the trees, I'm looking at the vital records. And in the vital records, they oftentimes will, give the cause of death. There's also the death age. And I had one family where I could see that some pretty close relatives were dying really, really young, like 50 or early 50s. And I notified my client about this, and she talked to her new aunt, her biological aunt, and it turns out that the family had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, which I'm guessing about 10% of the cases is genetic. And if it's detected really early, then it's very treatable.
Right.
So, that was a really nice thing for her to find out. Not so much, but
Right, to be,
oh, I'm sorry.
yeah, but to just be aware of the symptoms and to notify her doctors that this could be a possibility.
Right. Because before this, when you go to your doctor and they ask for your family medical history, she had nothing to say about her birth father. So she now was, I think, in her early 40s and had I think 4 kids. And just to think through, like, what if she wouldn't have known that? And, what if one day this happened and it was caught too late? She would have had all of these kids
Right.
in that
I
family.
think that, with my cousin finding her birth family, she had no desire to. Her dad really wanted her to do this ancestry.com or something because he had done it, my mother had done it, and, I had done it, and so he wanted her to find out, but it's been interesting that she could find out some health history, at
Mhm.
least on her mother's side. Her biological father doesn't really want to interact, but the biological aunt has given her some information. So that's really nice to know. I mean, it's like you said, you don't really want to know that non-Hodgkin's runs in your family, but gosh, what a great thing to know if you show symptoms or and get on it early. Wow.
Mhm.
So what if an adoptee doesn't want to discover their birth family, like I just said, but they're still concerned about their health issues they might have inherited? Are you finding people like that, like my cousin, who wasn't really interested?
Right, right. So sometimes people aren't interested for whatever reason, it's their choice. And but in building these trees and finding those vital records, and in particular the death certificates,
Mhm.
um, and other things, even you can figure out how long people lived because you're oftentimes figuring out what is the birth date and what is the death date. So you can see these patterns, and they don't have to know who their birth parent is, but just knowing who some of their ancestors are helps. And then another thing is that, of course, there are some communities where diseases run more rampant in them.
Mhm.
For example, in Ashkenazi Jewish families, there's a higher risk of certain genetic disorders, and things that just pop up because it's a community that marries within the community. So they are, it's cousins marrying distant cousins,
Mhm.
and where people are like cousins 3 or 4 or 12 different ways. And if they find out from their DNA test that they have some Ashkenazi Jewish heritage, then they can do DNA testing specific for that community. And there are clinics that offer like the Ashkenazi Jewish panel for
Right.
people of that faith.
I found that so interesting because, I ended up talking to my husband about that after we had spoken the day week or so ago, and I said, "Oh, there's a Jewish community." He said, "Oh, Ashkenazi Jews have genetic disorders," and I guess I know of some of the genetic disorders of different ethnic groups, but I had not known about that, so that was really interesting to me. Now, okay, so I have a question. How reliable are these? Like I had mentioned that my cousin and I both did one of the testing, and then like 123 Me. Are they reliable, or are there limitations to the health information they can provide?
There are definite limitations to the health information. And for example, 23andMe provides health information. And if you look carefully at the website, they will spell out what those limitations are.
Mhm.
For example, they do test for breast cancer, and they're looking at 3 mutations in the BRCA1 and BRCA2 gene. Um, and those 3 mutations are the most common in the Ashkenazi Jewish population. But at the same time, they're not the most common for non Ashkenazi Jewish people.
Mhm.
So that means that if someone does a test and they don't read the fine print, they might feel like I'm in the clear if I get a negative test, yet they're not, because they still don't know, because for them, whatever mutations are prevalent in their population haven't been checked.
Right, right. Interesting. I know. I think that with breast cancer, there's such a prevalence of genetic predisposition in for so many cancers are environmental or who knows why they pop up. Our cells just end up mutating. But with breast cancer, that's one that there is definitely that genetic component. So it would be really interesting to do the DNA testing to find out. You had shared with me that you were doing DNA testing on bone marrow transplant patients or for bone marrow transplant. And that was, I was a bone marrow transplant nurse. So I just loved finding that out. And I'd shared how this young man had donated his bone marrow to a perfect stranger. And what a gift that is to do that DNA testing and find that there are matches to different organ donations or stem cell donations. So that must give you great pride in knowing that you helped implement those types of transplants and interactions with people.
Right, right. It's amazing. And back in the day, we were only testing through serology.
Mhm.
They're using antibodies to test. And at that time, family sizes were getting smaller and smaller, so that there's only a 1 in 4 chance that you'll match your sibling for a bone marrow transplant. And if you only have one sibling instead of 5 siblings, your chances are you're not going to be matches. And so that's when that whole, and I'm sure you know this, the NMDP, the National Marrow Donor Program, started, where people can say, if I match somebody, you can take my bone marrow and give it to that person.
Right.
And that was a huge, huge thing where, it really helped it helped so many people find a matching donor.
Right. That, I mean, gosh, but what a selfless gift, the people that do donate to people they don't know. So, Mary, I could just talk to you all day because I find it so fascinating. But how can people get in touch with you?
Oh, thanks for having me. And to get in touch with me, they can go to my website, which is dnahunters.com. And it's all there on the website.
Great. Well, I hope that if you're at all interested, if you're an adoptee or you know someone that's been adopted, encourage them to check out Mary's site because it really is fascinating. So, Mary, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thanks, Maureen. I appreciate it.
Have a great day.
You too.